I'm Rick Harp. This is your APTN News Brief for Wednesday, March 20th. We begin in Ottawa, where Auditor General Karen Hogan has just released reports on First Nations housing and policing. And likely to the surprise of almost no one, Hogan gave the federal government failing grades on both. Fraser Needham reports.
After 4 audit reports, I can honestly say that I am completely discouraged.
Auditor General Karen Hogan says nothing has changed in the past 20 years when it comes to the poor quality housing First Nations communities have become used to.
That so little has changed, and that so many First Nations individuals and families continue to live in substandard homes.
The auditor's latest report finds Ottawa has only completed 20% of its commitment to close the First Nations housing gap by 2030. First Nations people are 4 times higher to live in overcrowded housing and 6 times higher to live in homes needing major repairs than the non-Indigenous population, according to the 2021 census. And mold continues to be a problem in many First Nations homes. Indigenous Services Minister Patty Hajdu acknowledges there are problems, but says the government remains committed to closing the First Nations housing gap by 2030.
That's why that goal is in place, so that it focuses the mind of all departments of the Government of Canada that we need to work faster and that we need to be making ambitious investments like the ones we've already made, but I would argue more, and that we need to be working with partners to make sure that we have the creative solutions to closing that gap.
When it comes to First Nations policing services, Hogan says the government didn't do well in this area either. All too often, her report finds, money targeted for these services isn't getting to where it is supposed to.
We also found that because of staffing shortages over the past 5 years, the RCMP has been unable to fully staff the positions for which it receives funding under the program's agreements. This leaves First Nations and Inuit communities without the level of proactive and community-focused policing services that they should receive.
The auditor's report finds $13 million targeted for First Nations policing services in the 2022-2023 fiscal year went unspent, and 62 RCMP positions funded under the Community Tripartite Agreement went unhired. Public Safety Minister Dominic LeBlanc says staffing shortages have been a problem, but believes new RCMP Commissioner Mike Duhaime is making headway.
It's not a secret. Commissioner Duhaime has talked about some of the challenges around recruitment in the RCMP and filling some of the vacant positions that exist. I think he's got an effective plan that will and has already started to deal with this challenge, but that's one of the realities that the RCMP is facing.
Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Sticking to Ottawa and Parliament Hill, NDP MP Leah Gazan pushed forward the idea of red dress alerts this week, a Canada-wide emergency system to help locate missing Indigenous women and girls. The alerts received the unanimous support of the House of Commons a year ago. Now, the Standing Committee on the Status of Women has begun their study on the topic. Annette Francis has more.
I am standing alongside my sisters.
NDP MP Leah Gazan has been at the helm for the calls to action. Last May, she gathered in the foyer of West Block with families of missing or murdered.
To support them in their calls on the government to fully support a Canada-wide emergency, immediately support the development of a national red dress alert system without delay.
A Canada-wide system would alert the public through cell phones and other media when an Indigenous woman, girl, or two-spirit person goes missing. On Tuesday, before the Committee on the Status of Women began its first study on red dress alerts, Gazan addressed the media.
We know from the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, calls for justice 9.1 to 9.11, that current systems that are there to protect us aren't. This is a critical initiative. This is an initiative that will save lives. And I'm urging the Liberal government to get this through with proper consultations by the Indigenous community.
Later, the committee welcomed its first witnesses. One of them was Kurt Eby, a director at Pelmorex, the company that operates the weather alert system. He said a red dress alert would take no time to put in place.
Everyone's familiar with the Amber Alert. We recently added Silver Alerts to the system, which is if someone with Alzheimer's or dementia or cognitive disabilities goes missing, you issue what's called Silver Alert. That's being piloted in Quebec. There has been some Silver Alerts issued. It's really no different than that, it's another vulnerable person use case, and you would add that to the system and issue the alerts the same way. And I think this is a well-known issue. I think Canadians generally, if they saw red dress alert, they would understand what it was talking about.
Jennifer Justy created her own system, the Unama'ki Emergency Alert. It serves 5 Mi'kmaq First Nations. Once subscribed to it, one can choose to receive an alert through text message, email, or landline. Justy developed it in response to the Nova Scotia mass shooting in April 2020. She said, however, there have been challenges because law enforcement has not requested the use of her alert system.
So we did have an Indigenous woman go missing, reported by an off-community or off-reserve organization. She didn't show up for curfew. They immediately phoned the police to say, and this was at 10 o'clock at night, to say, hey, she didn't show up for curfew. The police chose not to request an alert to be sent out by me, and she was found dead the next morning. Would my alert have saved her life? Maybe, maybe not, but you didn't even give me a chance.
According to Gazan, there are 4 more committee meetings scheduled for the study. The consultation process will continue, but there is no deadline to have the system in place yet. Annette Francis, APTN National News, Ottawa.
The healing journey of day school survivor Jeffrey Papetit took center stage at a recent Catholic gathering in Trois-Rivières, Quebec. With more on his motivation and his message, APTN's Maricela Amador. A warning that this report contains sensitive details about sexual assault.
It's a courage to come here because I walked around with so much hatred.
Jeffrey Papetit is talking about the abuse and pain he suffered at day school. He shared his story in front of an audience that included priests, bishops, and other members of the Catholic Church.
Because I know that when I leave here, I'll feel good.
For many in attendance, it was their first time witnessing a story by a day school survivor. Papetit has been sober for over 16 years and said that speaking his truth in the basement of a church was another step on his journey toward recovery and healing.
From the age of 13, I was subjected to things that weren't right by a false priest.
He told the gathering that after he had been abused as a child by a priest, he lived his life in shame and fear.
I am here to free myself even more from the things inside me, because there are things that I've kept silent for far too long, for 38 years. It's been 3 years since I've managed to talk about things that go back even further in my childhood, since I was 13. I am thinking of my well-being and to continue taking care of myself on my journey.
Papetit recounted spending decades working on himself, adding that in the beginning, it was incredibly hard to talk about his experience in day school.
It's not easy to ask someone for forgiveness or for someone to forgive you. There are those who have done it with me, those who hurt me, those I hurt. I ask forgiveness of myself, first of all.
Marilyn Roy, the coordinator at the Notre Dame de Fatima Catholic Mission in Coujouac, said that Papetit's words touched her deeply.
For me, it's a question that's been on my mind for a long time, and in a particular way, for the last 7 years. It's an issue that I've dealt with on a daily basis. I would say that, as a non-Indigenous person, I find that there is a path towards reconciliation.
Roy added that it was necessary to listen to the stories of survivors and to resonate with them. At an event billed as one of reconciliation, Gilles Lemay, a bishop emeritus from Trois-Rivières, did not want to talk much about it.
The need for reconciliation is real. I won't expand on that too much.
For survivors who are still struggling from their trauma, Papetit had this to say.
I would suggest that they find the courage inside to free themselves from the things that hurt.
Maricela Amador, APTN National News, Trois-Rivières, Quebec.
And finally, leaders from Labrador and Quebec First Nations were in federal court Tuesday. They want the court to rule against a memorandum of understanding between the federal government and the Nunatugavut Community Council, also known as NCC. Signed in 2019 with the Council, the federal MOU includes recognition of the Indigenous rights of the NCC, but at a joint press conference featuring the Innu Nation of Labrador, the Nunatsiavut government, Inuit Tapir Kanatami, and the Assembly of First Nations of Quebec and Labrador, leaders were united in their contention that the NCC is not a legitimate rights-bearing organization. Grand Chief Simon Pokiu says the NCC poses a risk to Innu lands and resources.
NCC has no section of 35 rights. They are not indigenous group. that can hold rights. They are descendants of settlers who try to reinvent themselves to access resources, services meant for legitimate indigenous people.
And that's your APTN News Brief for Wednesday, March 20th. I'm Rick Harp.